Hi guys. I'm just gonna make a relatively short video to finish up muscle real quick. This will be posted, this material will be on your second test, which I sent you guys an announcement. Apparently I said that the second test would be not Tuesday after spring break, but Thursday. So I'm gonna stick with that, and on Tuesday we will start new material that will be on your third test. Okay, so let's finish this up. First off, I don't think I covered this in both classes. I'll just briefly tell you that after we talked about, well, actually, I don't know if I covered all of these. I think we did myasthenia gravis in both classes. We didn't necessarily talk about tetanus in both classes. Tetanus is a soil bacterium. It's relatively ubiquitous all over the place, and it produces a neurotoxin in anaerobic conditions, and it makes it difficult for you to relax your muscles, and it's deadly, and you can vaccinate for it. Then botulism is from same species, same genus, different species, also produces the toxin in anaerobic conditions, and it actually causes what's called flaccid paralysis, which means that you can't contract the muscle, and that's the basis of Botox cosmetic. And then these two, curare is derived from a plant, and I'm pretty sure it's South American, maybe Central, I don't know. And it's used in arrows and darts, and it basically is an acetylcholine antagonist. It blocks the receptors on the sarcolemma, and so whatever animal someone was hunting or trying to eat would usually die or at least fall down, often die because of asphyxiation, because of paralysis of the diaphragm. And then nerve gases, which the United States and other countries develop for warfare, actually inhibit acetylcholinesterase. Some pesticides do as well, but they're not necessarily meant to do that. It's just a side effect because, of course, the pests that we're trying to kill don't really have, for instance, a diaphragm. So they inhibit acetylcholinesterase, which means you could contract your diaphragm, but you couldn't relax it. So you would breathe in and not be able to breathe out. Okay, so next topic is skeletal muscle energy metabolism. So I want to talk about where skeletal muscles get their energy, and we already appreciate how much energy they require because, of course, they use it for cross-bridge cycling. They also use it for relaxation. They also use it for the action potential that precedes contraction. So basically, the form of energy that skeletal muscle primarily uses is ATP. That's the chemical form of energy. And skeletal muscle needs a ton of it. So just in theory, let's say that this is a skeletal muscle cell and it had 0 ATP available, and there was a bus about to hit this person. All of this is really, really slow, and you will get hit by the bus if you're waiting for instance, cellular respiration to occur, even glycolysis. So what happens is skeletal muscle tries to make sure that it's prepared for emergency situations. So the sources of energy for muscle contraction. First off, from the last time that the sarcomere contracted, remember that the myosin head was left in the energized position right after you hydrolyze ATP into ADP plus phosphate. Basically, you set the catapult and then you leave it in that high energy position. That means that it's ready for the first power stroke, and you kind of get that for free. Not really free, you paid for it before. So the myosin head is in the higher energy position. As soon as the tropomyosin moves out of the way, you just form that first cross bridge, phosphate falls off, and then you get your first power stroke. Okay, so basically you're going to get that one because you already paid for it. Then, what's the next quickest access to energy? The next quickest access to energy is creatine phosphate, which is stored inside skeletal muscle fibers, not in all tissues, but definitely in skeletal muscle. What creatine phosphate does is there's an enzyme called CPK or CK, creatine phosphokinase, and what it will do is it will take creatine phosphate, which is stored in the skeletal muscle sarcoplasm, and take used ATP, which is ADP, and donate its phosphate. So now I have creatine phosphate plus ADP goes to ATP, which I can use for, of course, cross-bridge cycling, and creatine. Okay, now this one chemical reaction is faster than even this, and certainly faster than all of these. So this gives you quick access to ATP because you stored it in a form that will allow you to do one chemical reaction to get you a molecule of ATP. So how long does this last? Well, it depends on how much you have stored in there, but generally speaking, this is available for about a minute of a brisk walk or 6 seconds of sprinting, and that can get you away out of the way of a bus. So basically, first power stroke, you kind of already prepaid for it. This gets you 6 seconds to a minute. And then what's next? Okay, then we're basically trying to ramp up and start the process of cellular respiration overlapping with this. So the next thing is, okay, we're going to start cellular respiration, but do we wait for the cardiovascular and respiratory system to catch up? No, we just start moving our skeletal muscle. So what we're going to do is we are actually going to use the oxygen first before the oxygen actually comes in from the bloodstream. Remember, we have oxygen bound to myoglobin in here, which is easier access. Okay, so small quantity of oxygen was bound to myoglobin, so you can start aerobic cellular respiration even before the cardiovascular and respiratory systems catch up, because you start exercising before your heart rate or your respiratory rate goes up. Okay, and then where are you going to get the glucose? Well, we have quicker access to the stored glycogen than to the glucose through the bloodstream because, again, we start exercising before the cardiovascular and respiratory system are actually catching up. So we use stored glycogen next, okay, actually kind of at the same time that we're using the myoglobin. And so the major source at the beginning of exercise for most of us is going to be the glycogen that is in here. And assuming we had myoglobin storing oxygen in here, then we can do cellular respiration relatively well before our cardiovascular and respiratory systems catch up and supply oxygen and glucose through the bloodstream. So this breakdown of glycogen is the major source of nutrients at the beginning of exercise, 5 to 10 minutes. And then you have given yourself time enough for the cardiovascular and respiratory system to start delivering more glucose and more oxygen. So you would have potentially used this up, you might have used this up, you might have taken all of the oxygen off of myoglobin, but it's okay because now I'm catching up with what's actually being delivered by my bloodstream. So the next 30 minutes is depending on how much you've eaten and how much you have stored. So the next 30 minutes is primarily powered by blood glucose. So now I am like 41-ish minutes in, okay? Then what happens? Generally, unless you've been really, really carbo loading, you're going to run out of glucose at that point. And then what's going to happen is your skeletal muscle is going to switch over to burning fatty acids, which it can totally do. Now, am I saying that it takes you 45-ish minutes before you start burning fat? No, that's before this cell starts burning fat, because this is a muscle cell and it has all these extra stores. Other things could be burning fat because you're exercising, but this muscle cell had all those extra stores. Okay, so basically this goes all the way back to the cellular respiration, the stuff that we talked about before. Breaking glycogen down to glucose is called glycogenolysis. Breaking glucose down to pyruvate and ATP is still called glycolysis, yes? And then taking pyruvate and breaking it down to carbon dioxide, water, and way more ATP is via Krebs and oxphos. So you already knew this. Glycogen, glucose, that's glycogenolysis. Glucose, pyruvate, that's glycolysis. Pyruvate and its buddy all the way through to ATP, carbon dioxide, and water out here. That's Krebs and oxphos. So you have known that. But what is special about skeletal muscle is it also has the ability to do this, to take that pyruvate and generate a little bit more ATP right here, pyruvate or lactate, but it generates a byproduct called lactate or lactic acid. This is anaerobic respiration. What's the point? The point is that it's actually going to generate you a little bit more ATP even when you don't have oxygen. It's definitely nowhere near as much as this. So why would you do it? Well, sometimes you still need to move your muscles even though you don't have oxygen. You won't be able to sustain it for very long. A, it doesn't generate much ATP, and B, the lactic acid buildup will cause a problem. Okay, so here's some notes. Glycogenolysis, this process right here, doesn't require oxygen. Glycolysis, doesn't require oxygen. Anaerobic respiration doesn't require oxygen, only produces a little bit of ATP. But why does fatigue occurs? Fatigue occurs due to a lack of ATP, right? You can't actually contract very well if you don't have ATP for cross-bridge cycling. And also because of the buildup of lactic acid. They used to teach, even when I took phys, that lactic acid caused muscle soreness, and then they figured out that it actually doesn't. It's correlated with muscle soreness, but if you, for instance, suffuse a muscle with oxygen and then make it work really hard, it will become exhausted and it will become sore, and there won't be lactic acid because there's oxygen. So muscle soreness seems to primarily be connective tissue strain and not lactic acid buildup. But muscle fatigue does seem to be lactic acid buildup. Lactic acid gets in the way of cross-bridge cycling when it starts to build up. Okay, and then this, Krebs and oxphos, those require oxygen, produce boatloads of ATP. So the next thing to think about is after you finish exercising, why is your heart rate and respiratory rate still relatively high for a little while after you finish exercising? Well, because what you have to do before you are done with that blood flow and oxygen requirements is you have to replace all of this stuff that you used before. You have to replace the glycogen, you have to replace the creatine phosphate, and although it's not shown here, you have to replace the oxygen onto myoglobin. So you've got a debt to repay so that you can leave this muscle fiber ready for the next time. So your cardiovascular and respiratory system stays working at a relatively high rate for longer than it seems would be natural. So what do I need to do? I need oxygen even after, because I need to replace the oxygen onto myoglobin, also onto hemoglobin, because I use that from my bloodstream, right? Oxygen from here. And then creatine phosphate must be replaced. And what I do is I actually use ATP to make creatine phosphate so that I can have quick access to it for the next time, because I can't store vast quantities of ATP, but I can store creatine phosphate, which can rephosphorylate ADP. And then I need to take lactic acid and I need to make it back into, it has to be oxidized ultimately back to glucose by the liver, and this requires oxygen as well. And then I need glucose for a while so that I can replace the glycogen stores. So all of these nutrients and energy for anabolic reactions and oxygen, all of these are still required even after you relax because you have to be ready for the bus next time. So the net effect is that you continue to breathe deeply and rapidly and your heart rate stays high even after exercise. They call this repaying the oxygen debt, but it's not just oxygen, it's also nutrients. So it's oxygen and nutrients debt. And then the other thing, of course, is that working out tends to heat up your body. And so you actually need a relatively high rate of energy and oxygen to cool it down. So it's actually heats up your body pretty well. Of the energy released as glucose is broken down, only about 40% of it gets used for skeletal muscle contraction for ATP. The rest of it actually just generates heat. So that's why you need to cool your body down when you're working out, and it's also why shivering works to heat up the body. Okay, last thing, and then we'll just talk about smooth muscles. So skeletal muscle adaptation to exercise. So you know that depending on what kind of exercise you do, your muscles adapt differently. So if you look at a couple of extremes, if you look at these two athletes, they are both athletes. This guy's a sprinter and this guy's a marathoner. Both of these two guys are marathoners. And you can see the difference in the development of their muscle They are both lean, they are both relatively high muscle mass, but they're different because they did different kinds of training. So let's talk about how that occurs. So, of course, you are pretty much born with all of the muscle cells you're ever going to have. So, embryonically, mitosis occurs, and you have these little uninucleated muscle cells called myoblasts. But then during embryonic and fetal development, those fuse to form these multinucleated cells. That's just a muscle fiber. That process is called syncytium. But once they have become multinucleated in a whole muscle fiber, they don't undergo mitosis, with the exception of the fact that there's a few muscle stem cells called satellite cells. So any repair or regeneration, if you damage a whole muscle fiber, is usually because of the satellite cells. Luckily, muscle fibers are so long that you don't usually damage the entire thing. So basically at birth, you're pretty much going to have all of the muscle fibers you're ever going to have. So what happens in adulthood? So you obviously have bigger and longer and wider muscles than you did as an infant. But that is not because you have more muscle fibers. It's because your muscle fibers increase in length and increase in diameter, but not because you get more, any appreciable number more. So let's look at two different kinds of exercise. The kinds of exercise that would cause muscle hypertrophy, in which muscles actually get bigger, and this is an extreme example of muscle hypertrophy, and the kind of muscle response you get when you're doing relatively longer term aerobic training. So let's look at the difference. Okay, so muscles will hypertrophy, meaning get much bigger, only when they are contracted to 75% of their maximum tension or more. This is basically high weight, low rep activity. And this is, of course, muscle hypertrophy. Ignore that. My husband's sending me things. Okay, so this is muscle hypertrophy. And so what you're going to be doing is you're going to be trying to lift something or move something that's at the upper limits of your tension capacity. And what you're doing when you do that is communicating to your muscle fibers that I require more strength of you in the future. And then if you will feed them with nutrients, especially amino acids, protein, and rest them, what they will do is they will respond to that communication by increasing the number of actin and myosin myofilaments and the number of myofibrils in your muscle fibers. It is preferentially those big, thick, white muscle fibers, the fast glycolytic, that enlarge. They are the bigger ones, and you're preferentially training those, and you're getting more myofibrils in those. So they have relatively little myoglobin. They make ATP anaerobically, but they're large and they're strong. And so this is white meat, basically. So, I mean, they're a predisposition for training for the white fibers. And with this situation, only a few contractions at a time are necessary or possible, but you do need to rest the muscle group so that it can do protein synthesis the next day instead of more muscle contraction. If you do not rest the muscles, then they will not have the opportunity for protein synthesis because they'll be using their ATP for contraction instead. Okay, and then the other extreme, and of course there's all kinds of in-betweens, is this weaker activity, not meaning that, it's weak to run, just meaning that you are nowhere near 75% of your maximum tension. That, even if prolonged, does not result in significant muscle hypertrophy. So you can see that his muscles aren't larger, even though they are going to have incredible tone. This guy's a sprinter, this guy's a marathoner. It's different kinds of training, really fast, strong action, really long-lasting action. So weak activity like aerobic exercise, far less than 75% maximum tension, even if prolonged, does not result in a much hypertrophy at all. This is long duration, low intensity exercise, and it's communicating a different thing to your skeletal muscles. It says to them, you are strong enough for the job, but I need you to be able to work for long periods. And preferentially, the red fibers, the oxidative fibers, will respond to that kind of training. And over time, you will develop more capillaries, more myoglobin, and more mitochondria because it's aerobic, right? And it gets you greater muscle tone, greater muscle endurance, greater fatigue resistance as long as oxygen is available. The girth of the muscle, the actual width of the muscle, may actually decrease slightly as the muscle become toned and slimmed. I'm not saying the person is lighter in mass because their actually muscle is, of course, heavier than fat. But this kind of training is going to get an increase in muscle tone, but not necessarily bigger, wider muscles. But of course, this type of training also produces beneficial changes in the respiratory and the cardiovascular system because they're necessary to maintain this activity. So if you wanted, for instance, an increase in muscle mass and an increase in muscle longevity, you would either have to do a combination of these two types of training in which you, for instance, lift weight and do aerobic activity. These guys are extremes, but you to get the cardiovascular and respiratory benefits and the increase in muscle mass that, of course, will dramatically increase your metabolism, you'd have to do a little both. So what happens as you age? The maximum force or tension that can be generated by a muscle decreases 30 to 40% between the ages of 30 and 80. But this is based on what you do with it, because I would be willing to bet that both of these men, all three of these men, would maintain their muscle mass better than somebody who was inactive in their youth. So what happens as you age is your fibers tend to decrease in diameter because you're not using them as much, generally speaking, and so you don't need to replace the actin and myosin and myofibrils. But a lot of that loss can be prevented by exercise. Okay, last little thing is just smooth muscle tissue by way of comparison. So how is smooth muscle tissue similar and how is it different than skeletal muscle? Well, you guys probably remember histology slides well enough, and we're not going to do cardiac muscle because we'll do it later. But here's your skeletal muscle, right? And here's your smooth muscle. So what do they have in common and what do they have different? Smooth muscle is non-striated. That's why it's called smooth. It's also under involuntary control. It's controlled not by the somatic nervous system, but by the autonomic nervous system. The cells do contain actin and myosin, but since the filaments do not line up, you get no sarcomeres and no striations. So this one's got striations and this one doesn't, even though the mechanism of contraction is actually similar. The cells are much shorter, smaller. They're spindle-shaped or eyeball-shaped, and they have one nucleus per cell. And most smooth muscle, not all, maintains the ability to divide into adulthood, which skeletal muscle does not. So if, for instance, you damage the wall of the uterus with a cesarean section, there is the likelihood that you are going to regenerate most of those smooth muscle cells. Okay. So the other thing about smooth muscle is that it can hold contractions longer than skeletal muscle. It has a much slower rate of cross-ridge cycling, so it uses less energy for contraction over the same time period. The calcium pumps on the SR are slower, which means for every calcium release, it stays around longer. You also don't store as much calcium because you dump it and leave it for a while, so you don't have to store as much. Now, the strength of contractions compared to skeletal muscle is similar, but it can maintain a much longer contraction because of these two things. And then the other thing about smooth muscle compared to skeletal muscle is that under normal physiological conditions, skeletal muscle only contracts when the somatic nervous system tells it to, but smooth muscle has multiple reasons for contracting. It can be initiated by the nervous system, not somatic, but it also can be initiated by other things. So smooth muscle quite often has what we call spontaneous electrical activity, in which the cell membranes just gradually depolarize, get an action potential, go back to resting, gradually depolarize, get an action potential. And this is not initiated by the nervous system. This is just the pacemaker action potentials in some smooth muscle. The autonomic nervous system, of course, can cause smooth muscle to contract, but it can also inhibit smooth muscle contracting. Whereas with the somatic nervous system, you either tell it to contract and it gets closer to contracting, or you just leave it alone. With the autonomic nervous system, you can actually actively stimulate smooth muscle or actively inhibit it, either one. And we'll learn about that when we get to the autonomic nervous system. Okay, and then there are other things that can make smooth muscle contract. All of the women listening know that hormones can actually, for instance, cause smooth muscle contraction, for instance, in the wall of the uterus. That's hormonally mediated. This one, hormones don't really do much to it. And then paracrine agents can sometimes cause smooth muscle contraction, like in the wall of your digestive tract or your respiratory tract. And then stretch alone. So one of the things that can, for instance, initiate smooth muscle contraction in the digestive tract is just like your stomach being full. That alone will initiate it. So there's lots of different reasons that smooth muscle could contract. Okay, and then last but not least, there are two actual types of smooth muscle. The one that people usually talk about is this first one, called visceral or single unit smooth muscle. So visceral or single unit smooth muscle works like this. Believe it or not, this is actually the synaptic terminals, or the autonomic nervous system's equivalent. There's neurotransmitters stored here. They're weird looking, but imagine that the axon came from there. And then all of these cells are connected together via gap junctions. So if I wanted to stimulate this, all I really have to do is talk to these cells and they will tell the rest. That's why they call this single unit smooth muscles, because all of the cells behave as a single unit. This would be like the smooth muscle in the wall of your digestive tract that can do peristalsis. Okay, so single unit, also called visceral, which means guts. Okay, visceral or single unit. And this is the one that you have learned about many times. It like depolarizes spontaneously. It has gap junctions, relatively slow action potentials, causes peristalsis. This is sensitive to stretch, like in the wall of the stomach. It's actually really good at stretching really good at contracting even when it's stretched. So when can your stomach contract the best? Right after Thanksgiving dinner. And skeletal muscle is not that way. So there's some examples. And then the last thing is just this other type of smooth muscle that exists. Sometimes you want to be able to control smooth muscle cells individually. So you need to have them behave like multiple individual units. Each cell will have its own innervation. So look at this one. The difference is these cells are not connected by gap junctions, so you can control each one individually. So this is multi-unit smooth muscle, and it doesn't behave all together at one time. It can be controlled individually. So this would be in an area in which you want to be able to control. It's still involuntary, but you would, for instance, not want all of the smooth muscle in the wall of your artery or arteriole to contract. You would want just a ring of it so that you could change blood flow patterns. You don't want in the walls of your bronchioles, you don't want the entire airway to constrict. No. Around your pupil, to control the diameter of the pupil, those muscle fibers are individually innervated. The erector pili muscles in your skin. So again, those are multi-unit if they behave as multiple different units, and single unit if they behave all as one unit. Okay, there's a couple of different things that you guys may actually find interesting there if you want to look at them. And that's it for this. Make sure as you are studying, what most people do when they're studying is they flip through their notes. The last pages of notes people don't tend to look at, which means if I wrote you a really easy question about these two and you hadn't looked at it, you would miss it because you're like flipping through, getting through the hard stuff, and then you never even look at the stuff. Okay, so I hope you have a good fall break. I will see you on Tuesday. We will start new material briefly on Tuesday, and then on Thursday you'll have a test over this material. Seems like there's something else I'm supposed to tell you. Oh, don't forget to do your quiz. I can't remember when I made it due, but you can look on Top Hat. It's due sometime this weekend, I think, and make sure you get it done on time. Okay,